Hey patrons, welcome back to the second part in this tutorial series, and in this part we're going to be focusing on working on the background of this pig loose watercolour painting. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm just using a larger round brush and I'm simply going in with clean water and I'm just pre-wetting the whole of the background. I want to make sure that I'm getting into all of the edges, all of the corners, and just really make sure all of the background has got a nice even layer of water on it. And what you're aiming for is just a nice glistening layer. You don't want too many, you don't want any puddles. And then once I've just wet that left hand side of the paper, I'm just going to start by tapping in some light blue shades. And I'm starting off with very light colours and then I'll work my way up to more shadows. So that blue paint had quite a lot of water in it. I'm now adding a little bit of very diluted purple. And because the paper is nice and wet, the colours will very nicely bleed into each other. I'm now going to start to add in some greens, again keeping it very light and just tapping them in, and because the paper's wet and it bleeds out anyway, you don't have to spend lots of time trying to blend the colours together. It does it automatically when the paper is wet. I've now got a little less water and I'm just adding some slightly darker greens, still very light but just a little bit darker than before. I'm adding some splatters in as well because I do want to keep this nice and loose, so I do like to add splatters. When it's on a wet surface, it does bleed out though as well. You want to try not cover every single part of the background in paint. Sometimes it's nice to have like white light areas that just help to add more contrast, just preserve some of the whites as well. You don't have to cover the whole of the background in paint. I'm now just adding some Payne's Grey. That's the one colour I do know the name of, which is more of a bluey grey. You can just mix a little bit of blue and black together if you want to do that. I'm just adding some more blue. Again, working my way up to those darker colours. Just got a little less water. You can see that my paper does start to warp a little bit, but once it dries, it really does smooth out because it's taped down around all four sides, which just helps to keep everything nice and flat once it dries. So I definitely recommend taping your paper down. I'm now going to start to work on the right hand side. So just like we did on the left, I'm just pre-wetting it with clean water using my larger round brush. And I'm just going to go straight in and tap in some blue shades. Just the same way we did on the left hand side. Some of the Payne's Grey as well, using the same colours that we did on the left hand side. And going in with some green, and I'm just tapping those colours in, not in any particular order because I'm not really following the reference anymore, because the reference just had, normal like hay in the background kind of thing. I'm also just splattering some water into the background because we've seen when we did the pig that the water being splattered in, for example on the ear on the right hand side, you can see when you splatter in water it creates that really starry highlighted effect. I'm going in with some more Payne's Grey with a little less water, so you can see it's a little bit darker, and just working my way around the edges of the painting and adding a few splatters that will soften out a little bit. Just tapping a bit of water in there as well, and some more Payne's Grey. Doing the same on the left hand side, and I'm mainly going to be focusing the shadows of the background on the corners and on the sides. So I want it to be darkest around the edges and on the sides, and then get lighter towards the pig. So that's basically how I'm going to be working with this. And you can see that splatters do bleed out quite a bit, but they are still there a little bit as well. Another technique that you may want to try out to get some cool textures is whilst the paper is still wet, go in with some tissue, and that lifts up the paint. And this does only work whilst it's wet, and it can create some really nice effects, especially if the paint is really dark. I'm just working in some purples mainly focusing them around the edges of the painting. And I'm really just going with the flow as I do this. I'm not being too specific. I'm not doing it in really like a certain order. I'm just dropping in colours where I feel like it. I know the sort of colours that I wanted to have in the painting, and I know that I want it to be darker around the outside edge. But apart from that, I'm just simply going in and splattering and tapping in different colours. I'm also splattering in some clean water as well. So now it's time to work up to those darker colours. So I'm starting to add some black just at the bottom of the pig. And I really do want this pig to seamlessly transition into the background as well. So I will be adding quite a lot of black and dark purple around the pig, at the bottom of the pig, and also around the sides as well, which you can see me doing now. And I really will build up to some intense black shades. And like I said, remember that as the painting dries, it will naturally get lighter. So even though, for example, that black at the bottom of the pig looks quite dark, it does lighten up when the painting dries. I'm going to add some more green now. I'm just mixing it onto my palette and splatter it in. Just adding the green gives just another little pop of colour in there. And I'm just creating some pink splatters as well. And if you use bigger brushes, you'll get bigger splatters. So the bigger the brush you use, the bigger the splatters you use. And, vice versa. If you use really small brushes, then you are going to get really small splatters as well. I'm also splattering in some orange. And creating splatters on a wet and wet background helps to get that random look, because when you splatter, you never really know where it's going to go. But it also helps to give that soft look because it's still wet, so it does bleed out. But the splatters create more of a random, depositing of the colours. The orange is working really nice in that background. Really happy with how the colours are working together. I'm incorporating colours from the pig into the background as well as some other colours like yellows and greens as well. It's always good to use complementary colours in your paintings, because adding contrasting complementary colours just really helps to make the painting pop. So complementary colours, like I mentioned in the previous part, are colours that are opposite to each other in the colour wheel. And opposite colours in the colour wheel, when put together, can become more dull, but when they're used in different areas of a painting, it can just help make each of the colours pop out more. So for example, with purple, complementary colour is yellow. With, green, I think the complementary colour is red off the top of my head. So yeah, I'm just doing the same thing, just slowly getting darker, working darker purples and blacks through the sides and the corners. And I do like to drip a lot of water into the background as well. Because there's quite a lot of water on the background now, you can see that it bleeds out really fast, and it bleeds out more when there's more water on the paper, because there's more water to move the paint around. Not got much water in that black. Very, very concentrated now. I didn't mix in much water at all. Just working that through all of the colours and through all of the corners. And once this dries, when you do really dark backgrounds and you fill in the rest of the background, it can make the pig look even lighter and washed out. So we will be darkening up certain areas of the pig as well in a bit. Just working some more intense greens throughout the background, just tapping them in. And I like how you get some of those harsher edges around, for example, on the left hand side of the pig. I like having a mixture. So if any harsh edges form, I just let them happen because it's all meant to be quite loose. I'm tapping in some more pinks, just dropping some more pinks into the background. So I'm just looking around the painting, figuring out what I want to do next. So what I want to do is just add a little bit of salt just around the corners, and you can see with the pig the salt technique worked beautifully just to the left of the right ear. You can see that the salt creates a beautiful snowy starry effect. So I'm just sprinkling that on a few areas of the background just to help give the background more of an interesting look to it, help add some more like texture to the painting. So I'm just sprinkling that on a few places on the background, and you want to do this whilst the paper is still wet, whilst the paint is still wet, otherwise it won't work. But equally you don't want there to be like puddles of water, otherwise it won't work either. So you just want it to be nice and wet, a nice glistening layer rather than puddles, and definitely not too dry, otherwise it won't work as well. And you can use any sort of salt that you want. I just use table salt, but you can use and experiment with different types of salt, different sort of sizes of the salt granules. And as this dries, you'll really start to see the effect. You can kind of see it already starting to take shape. I'm also just getting a little bit of cling film. You can see I'm just sort of pressing it around, and cling film is great at creating like a very frozen, icy look as well. So I just like to lie the cling film down just on some wet areas and just pull it around. And this works best when it's left for a long time to dry. I won't be leaving this for too long, so it might not work as well. But if you leave it overnight, then it works great, and it works really good on darker colours and when the paint is nice and wet. This might be a little too dry in certain areas for it to work super well, but it'll still give us a little bit of texture, a little bit of a interesting texture in these few areas. So I just left it to dry for a little bit, not so much that it completely dried, but just so some of that water dried up, so there wasn't so many puddles. And I'm just, whilst it's still a little bit wet and whilst the wet and wet method will still work, I'm just dropping in some really intense purples and blacks, mainly around the borders and perimeter of the painting. And you can see that because it's a little bit drier, it doesn't bleed out quite as much. I'm also creating a few splatters with that same paint. And I'm working it just below the pig as well, because remember, we want there to be a nice contrast and shadow under the mouth of the pig, under the chin of the pig. And I'm just teasing that out as well. Just adding some more very, very concentrated paint now to the corners and to the sides. Hardly any water in there at all. All four corners. And now I want to darken up the nose, so I'm just going in with that same purple and black, but very little paint, because I do want to darken it up even more, so I don't want it to be really weak dilution. And I just want to go over this whole area once again, just to really darken it up. Just very carefully going around the nostrils and bringing it further down, just covering that whole shadow, and also fill in the other nostril. And you can see that that pops so much more now. Also work a little bit of this through the creases and rolls of the nose. They definitely need to darken up a bit. And just teasing with a little bit of clean water the edge of those, the edge of that paint that I've just added in, just so it's not so harsh. But I didn't add too much water because obviously we want to keep it nice and dark. Just adding a bit more paint, spreading that around a little bit. Follow that up around the creases of the nose once again. And now I'm doing this because once we did the background, the blacks there were a lot darker than the shadows on the pig, and we don't want the pig to look washed out. We want the pig to really pop. So we need to go and make sure that we're really darkening up the shadows on the pig as well, so that they match the darker shadows on the background. So I'm looking at the body and working some shadows through that, through the leg of the pig. Just darkening it up a little bit with that same black and purple, and underneath the pig. So you can go throughout all of the main shadows and just repeat this process. You can do it for the ears, for the eyes, for the bits of fur around the eyes. So you can see how the salt is starting to work in a few of those areas. I will probably add some more salt in a minute. And I'm using the tissue to also create some highlights and create some really cool highlight textures into the background. So look how well it lifts off the paint and creates some really cool patterns. Just doing this in a few random places all over the background, just to create some cool highlights and patterns. And like I said, I just want to go in and sprinkle in some more salt now. Just that same table salt, just sprinkling it in a few areas around the corners. So now that there's not quite so much water on the paper, it will work a little bit better now. Just want to bleed out the shadow on the pig. And I'm working on the shadow now that separates the face of the pig from the body, just to make that a bit more clearer, make that shadow a bit more clean and crisp. Adding a few detailed shadows indicating the direction of the fur as well in some of these strokes with the paintbrush. Now I'm just wetting that area so that I can drop in some darker blacks and purples to really darken up the shadow by the left eye. So I pre-wetted that area so that it really does bleed out and we don't get any harsh edges. And I'm really dropping in those intense blacks and purples into that area now. And you can see that because we pre-wet that surface, they are nicely bleeding out. You can see how well that salt has worked. It's working really well. Definitely adds a really cool pattern to the background. And it looks cool how that pattern is forming by the right ear. I like that, and how it's sweeping into the corner. I'm also adding some darker shadows just above the eye, in any areas that are still a bit too washed out. Creating a few little odd fur strokes as well. You can add as much detail as you want. You can add even more little fur strokes if you want to. Or you could add like none at all. You could be really expressive with it. Just really darkening up that corner with very little water. And because there's very little water down on the paper, it's mostly drying out. It really does give you that dark concentrated look. When it dries, it will be pretty much as dark as it is now. Just adding some water splatters to some of the darker areas. You can see already it's creating more of a subtle like starry effect in the top left hand side. Just going back in my tissue, creating a few more patterns. And you could do all of these effects and create all of these patterns in different areas. For example, you might have wanted to add more salt to the bottom left-hand side, for example. Now that I've let that completely dry, I just want to go through and add a few darker shadows. Now that everything is dry, it's easier to judge it, because when some areas are dry and some are wet, then, for example, the background looks really dark and really washed out the pig. But now that it's dry, it just brings everything together a bit more. So I'm just adding a few details around the eye, around the nose, a few little fur strokes, and just darken everything up a little bit more. You can see that with the background we've got a nice mixture of really soft wet and wet techniques, the water being dripped into the background in the top left hand corner. We've got the salt effect, we've got some harsh edges going on, we've got the tissue method. I'm using a very small round silver black velvet brush for this, just to get into those little details. And I'm going to work the brush through the bottom and the chin as well. Sorry about the shakiness of the camera, it will stop in a second. Just going to bleed out the bottom of that chin. Now I just want to work a little bit on the ear, just add a few little brush strokes for the fur, adding some brush strokes by the eye just at the bottom of that ear. and on the other ear as well. Just a few little wisps to indicate the direction and length of the fur, and just darkening up by that ear as well. Just mixing some pink onto my palette, getting a little bit of purple. So I've created a pink-purple mixture, and I'm just going to spread that over the ear on the left-hand side because it definitely needs to be darkened up. I added a little bit of water so that it just can easily flow throughout the rest of the ear, and we've got some darker areas and some lighter sections now. Also creating some darker shadow around the top of the pig to really clearly define the top of the head where that is. Now just rubbing away that salt that's on the actual pig. That needs to come off now. Just adding some darker shadow to the top of the pig's head where that little bit of dark fur is. So I'm just tweaking some areas now, adding some splatters. We'll be adding lots more splatters to the background in a minute. Just dropping in some more pink onto the pig's fur. I don't want to cover any of the techniques that I've done. For example, I don't want to cover up the salt effect. That's what I was talking about in part 1, that we don't want to overdo any areas and lose any cool effects that we've done. So try not to overwork any areas. Just adding a little bit of pink purple to transition from the shadows into the pink fur. I really love adding the splatters. I think it really helps pull everything together. You can see that I keep revisiting areas. I wait for them to dry and then I keep coming back, seeing if I need to darken anything up or add more saturated colours like the pinks. So look at your painting and figure out what areas you're unhappy with and what you can do to, make them a little bit better. Just keep looking at areas, even if you think you've already finished them. Keep looking back. Are they dark enough? Is it interesting enough? Do you need to add any little details? Do you need to add a few little fur marks just to give a bit more detail? Is it looking a bit too basic? I now went back to the ear and I just want to actually just fill in a little bit over that starry effect that we've done, because doing that has lost the shape of the ear a bit. So I just want to go and add a little more shadow. I don't want to cover it up completely, but I definitely needed to darken up that area. So I just stained it and darkened up and created that line, that separation line from the top of the ear to the inside of the ear. But I didn't cover up the whole of that water splatter effect that we created. Just covered up enough to show the true anatomy of the ear. Okay, that ear is looking a lot better now. Just by doing those few tweaks, I'm adding some more black to the other ear. Really need to keep darkening that up. And also just above the eye. If you see me tapping with my tissue, it's because I feel like it's too dark or I'm not happy with the placement. So I just remove it by dabbing on some tissue and then I try again. Adding some more shadow around the nose, curving that shadow around the creases of the nose as well. Darkening up the shadows on the body once again. Now I'm just pulling around my cling film a bit. Just drying out a little bit. Adding some darker pinks all around the pig's face. See, I build things up very slowly, but you might be finished already if you just, for example, put some dark pinks in to start with. I tend to go too light and have to keep darkening things up and keep darkening things up because I'm scared to go too dark too soon with watercolours. I'm scared to bleed together really dark colours, so I'd rather work with lighter shades and then add shadows if I need to once everything's dry, and just add a little bit of a dark colour and then just use water to help blend it out. But you can do it however you want. There'll be maybe some techniques that I'm doing that you really like, and then other things that you have a way that you prefer doing. I'm just going in with a bit of a pipette and just dropping in some water. This can be really cool for creating those little cauliflower effects, just by using a pipette to randomly drop down some water. For example, it works really well if you do it from a high angle. It creates really intense splatters. So a pipette works really great for that. Or also dripping alcohol into a background or anything gives really interesting effects as well. So if you want to try that out, that definitely gives an unusual, unique effect to the painting. So just getting something like rubbing alcohol and just dropping that into the background, into your painting. Once again, just tweaking things. I'm just going to be going back and forth quite a lot. I'm not working on like one area. It's just fixing little things, adding little details, and just really adding more saturation to certain colours. So that's all I'm going to be doing for the next few minutes. So now I'm taking a much larger brush and dipping it into my pink. I'm going to start to add some splatters. So adding quite a bit of water so that the splatters come off well from the brush. And like I said, bigger brushes, it's easier to get bigger splatters. So I'm just flinging the paint around. More water means that you can definitely get bigger splatters. but they'll be more diluted. I'm just going to do this with a few different colours. Once again, remember you do have that tissue. If you create any splatters which you're like, oh my god, no, that looks awful, that's gone in the wrong place, you can just simply go and lift it straight back up with your tissue. If you do it straight away, it won't stain, hopefully. But it will definitely lighten it up a lot. Now I'm going to add some more splatters, this time with orange. So I'll be doing quite a lot of splatters using colours that I've used throughout the pig and throughout the background. You can see that I'm doing a lot of big splatters, but also when you fling the brush you do get a mix of bigger splatters and smaller splatters. I'm also going to create a variety between really dilute splatters with a lot of water and then using more concentrated colours. So now I'm using more concentrated orange. Another cool technique that you could try is using a toothbrush and spraying on the paint. That creates really tiny splatters. It almost looks like blood spray, or it's great for creating like tiny stars. Now I'm going to create some purple splatters. Just getting my purple onto a palette with a bit of water. Need a bit more water actually. If there's not enough water, it's just really hard to create splatters. And just flinging that and tapping that everywhere, particularly around the pig. So just tapping that up so that it's lighter, but it still is slightly staining the paper. And adding splatters just helps so much with the loose style of the painting. I think it really just helps to, you know, concrete in what the style is supposed to be. It really helps to give that loose, very expressive style to the painting. Just adding a bit more pink. Fling in some more pink around. And often I'll just remove bits. I'll leave little bits of these splatters showing through, but I may remove half of it, just so it's not so bold. Adding in some yellows now, just to make it more colourful. I really wanted this painting to be nice and colourful. Now I'm intensifying the corners and edges of the painting by going in with some more blacks and purple and just intensifying the edges a little bit more. Just because, like I said, it really does lighten up when it dries. I'm also using that dark black purple mixture to add in some splatters. I'm adding in some really big ones and some smaller ones as well. I do like to have a range of the splatters. I do like to have a few bigger ones and then some really tiny ones. So I'm just using my pipette to actually get some of the pink out of the pan, and you can use the pipette to actually help squeeze and create splatters as well, so that's another technique. So you can do it with the different colours, with the orange. I wanted to try this technique out with. It just helps to create more control because, like I said, with a paintbrush, it's a bit harder to know where that splatter is going to land. But with a pipette, it's a lot easier to know exactly, just put this back, to know exactly where it's going to land. So a lot of the paint will come out at the start and then there'll be a little bit less in the pipette, so you can get some really small splatters as well. I'm really happy with how this is looking so far. I think the pig and the background works really well together and the different colours work well. You can also really easily intensify certain splatters you've already got in by going in with more concentrated paint and just pipetting it onto the splatters. Just sprinkling a little bit of salt into a few more areas so that once this area has dried, we get a few little starry effects going on. You can also use pipettes to actually remove some water. So if you find that you've got puddles forming, then that's a really cool hack. You can actually pipette out some of the water. You can also use flat brushes. I'm just showing you different ways you can create splatters. So you could use flat brushes, normal brushes, toothbrushes, pipettes. Flat brushes like this are also great if you want to create some little fur strokes, and if you just get very, very dry paint on there, you can basically dry brush them onto the paper. It's really, really good. As you can see, I do add a lot of splatters towards the end of a painting. But anyway guys, that is pretty much it for this second part. We've worked on the background and darkened up shadows on the pig. So I'm going to let this all dry, peel off the cling film, and then I'll be back to finally just add some highlights with some whitewash. So I'll see you in the next part. Bye everybody.